Hello, everyone. My name is Romaine Johnson, and I want to share with you the latest in the Harry Barnes Medical Society virtual grand rounds. This is a panel discussion on race, work, and leadership. The first discussion will be from Dr. Van Wise, who will just be going over the Otolaryngology Surgeon Scientist program at the NIH. Followed by that, we'll have our guest speakers to discuss race, work, and leadership. It was an excellent outing. I hope you all enjoy it. Take care.
All right, well, thanks very much for the opportunity to speak to your group about research training opportunities and the Otolaryngology Surgeon Scientist program at NIDCD. I've been here at NIH for 27 years and have been involved in training a number of otolaryngologist surgeon scientists over that time period. And I'd like to share with you some of the programs that we have and some of the folks that have come through the program that have gone out into the community and assumed academic careers and posts throughout the country. So the NIH has a long history of, and NIDCD have a long history of research training programs that include within them recruiting a diverse and developing a diverse scientific workforce. One of these is the NIH Undergraduate Research Scholars Program. So in this program, really trying to reach interested young people at the collegiate level in developing a career in biomedical research. And these students are supported not only in their undergraduate training and have opportunities to come to NIH for summer research, but are encouraged to come to NIH later at different time points and given opportunities to even have a career at NIH or out in the extramural community and academic centers. Similarly, the NIH Academy for Post-Baccalaureates is another program that is for those students who finish their undergraduate and are interested in a bridge year or two before they enter either medical school or PhD programs. And then during medical school, the NIH Medical Research Scholars Program is a program that brings in students from all over the country to spend a year either between the second and third or the third and fourth years in NIH laboratories, and also with a didactic clinical research training program that parallels that, so that on the other end they come out with a strong background in both laboratory and clinical research. And NIH also has MD, PhD graduate partnership programs for students who are interested in combined degree training. One of the most prominent of those is the NIH MD, PhD Oxford Cambridge program, where the students go to a medical scientist training program in their American medical school and then go over to Oxford or Cambridge University for 4 years, 2 of the 4 years, and NIH for 2 of the 4 years towards their PhD, which they get from those universities, and then come back and complete their training in medical school. And NIDCD has had a clinical research fellow program since it's close to its inception, and more recently an otolaryngology surgeon scientist program. So just a couple of examples of some of the people who've come through our program. Sadana Jackson, Dr. Sadana Jackson, trained in my laboratory. She came to us in the NIDCD NIH Undergraduate Scholars Program, and she then went on and completed her medical training at Eastern Virginia Medical University and pediatric residencies, and then completed dual pediatric neuro-oncology and clinical pharmacology fellowship at Johns Hopkins before coming back to NIH, and is now an assistant clinical investigator in our neuro-oncology branch, which is a joint effort of the National Institute on Neurological Disorders and Stroke and the National Cancer Institute. And so Sadana actually started in my lab, and now she's just down the hallway from me, sharing a lab with us. Dr. Giovanna Thomas, trained in the Clinical Research Fellow Program. She came to us after her MD, her residency in Odo at Georgetown, and fellowship in head and neck and microvascular reconstruction at University of Michigan. And she was here for 5 years between 1996 and 2000, and went out and got a K award and is now an associate professor of otolaryngology, head and neck surgery at University of Miami. Some of the other clinical research fellows that have come through the program include Anil Lawani, who's a professor at Columbia University, Daniel Chu, who might be familiar to Dr. Johnson. He trained at Cincinnati and was faculty at Cincinnati Children's. John-Sun Wu at Stanford University. Frank Andre, Conrad Smith might be familiar to Dr. Myers. So the Surgeon Scientist program has kind of evolved out of this Clinical Fellows program to enable us to provide even longer early career development, essentially incorporate the fellowship and the K award, our version of the K award, intramurally. So this is a mentored early career faculty development program. It integrates both clinical and basic research, and graduated independence and resources are provided during the time of this this program, which can vary between 3 to 6 years. A culture of scholarly inquiry and scientific rigor is encouraged, and there are opportunities to maintain clinical and surgical skills, which is something we've worked towards by partnering with other university and government programs in the vicinity of the NIH. And for example, the NIH campus in Bethesda, Maryland, shown here in the center of this aerial photograph, is across the street from Suburban Hospital, which was acquired by Johns Hopkins University. And we've developed several of our faculty in collaboration with Johns Hopkins. Walter Reed National Medical Military Medical Center across the street, and the USIS University program across the street are other potential areas, institutions for collaboration. And we have one of our faculty is jointly appointed at Georgetown. We have been in conversations with GW, and as far as Howard University goes, we have not yet developed a faculty member jointly, but I'm hoping that that'll be one of our next opportunities. So our current class that's mostly graduating from the program includes Dr. Clint Allen here, who's now in the tenure track NIH investigator, Dr. Nikki Schmidt, who just took a job as the co-director at Emory University's Winship Cancer Center, and Dr. Wade Chen, Mike Hoa, and Niall London are currently in the program. So we're looking for the next generation and next group of potential participants in this program. And I can share this slide set with the program if you wish. It has the website for the program. We encourage people to apply between October and December of their chief or their fellowship year. And we would like a cover letter of their research and career interests and plans in addition to their CV. And those applicants who are considered further will be invited for a seminar meeting with NIDCD leadership and faculty while they apply to independent academic programs in the community. And that's my presentation. Thanks very much for letting me present, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Van Wise. Does anyone have any questions?
No, Carter, this is Rod. I do want to thank you for the presentation and sharing this opportunity with our group. And so we'll make sure we continue to keep it front of mind, and as we develop help to develop some of the future leaders in otolaryngology?
So one of the things I just wanted to just reinforce is that the Clinical Research Fellow Program is one way in which if you want to send your up and coming young leaders for a period of training at NIH and then bring them back to your university, that's something we've done in partnering with a number of universities. And an example of that was John Sun Woo, who I mentioned, who came from Washington University at St. Louis and went back there as a faculty member before he went to Stanford.
All right, very good. Well, thank you again. All right, well, if there are no other questions, let's move into the main program. And I was hoping to go in alphabetical order. So if Dr. Francis, if you could get ready to do your part of the discussion. And of course, he's a man who needs no introduction. And thank you so much again for agreeing to participate in this interesting talk.
Good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to see your faces. It's felt like I've been in the desert. Doctors Johnson and Powell, really appreciate you asking me to do this. I've been asked to, let me see if I can share my screen. Get the right talk up here. Asked to give various, can you see? Can you see my screen there? Talks of diversity over the last year, particularly since the summer. And I have to say that this has been an emotionally draining year for many reasons, not the least of which is that I'm a new chair in a COVID year. So welcome. But this is really, it's just further, this has been an interesting assignment. I was asked to review one of the essays, the one entitled Managing Diversity, Managing Blackness, an Intersectional Critique of Diversity and Management Practices. And I'll just try to stay brief because, it's a somewhat very academic paper with frameworks that are in the social sciences, but I think are very relevant to what we see in our day-to-day lives, especially as we've come through predominantly white institution. In my case, I did have not attended a historical Black university. I have benefited from many mentors. I see Ernie Myers there, for example, who, were at those institutions and others from Morehouse, etc. But I've sort of found my way through these experiences. And I've, and there are a number of different things that one sort of buries and sort of scars over, and you sort of keep moving on. But it's, as one becomes more leadership focused, it's really critical to understand what the framework is that creates a very sometimes confrontational environment, or environment where people don't do well. I think that institutions have, as this paper posits, done relatively, have made some progress in moving the needle in terms of numbers of us, and numbers of people of color who are in the ranks. But what persists is a concern of inclusion, a true sense of belonging, a true sense of a chance, being promoted, included, and equity in terms of what we would call, success. And this has persisted despite a significant amount of investment in so-called diversity and inclusion officers. And we know many of them of our institutions have these individuals who are in their own right highly accomplished and extremely talented But what they posit in this paper is that these individuals are asked to function within a particular, very restricted framework. And that in the end, the D&I officers often adopt, as I've said here, an individual approach whereby they seek to help Black employees fit into a dominant culture without necessarily addressing the underlying systemic issues of racism in that culture. And I think that is true. And I hope I hope it means is that we are in an evolution, that the idea that DEI is important enough to put money behind it at all is movement in the right direction. It is not by any means the destination. However, it's worthwhile understanding what the mechanisms of failure are in terms of these roles. There are three of them that they've described, three categories. One is the tendency for the promoting the business case for diversity rather than the justice case for diversity. Secondly, holding narrow imaginations of Blackness. I think that's wrong. I'll come back to that. And then applying a blanket perspective of diversity. As it relates to promoting the business case for diversity, I think that this is mixed, and I don't know if I fully agree, but I do believe they are right in saying that some companies may be at the exclusion of looking at the justice question and the equity issues within their ranks and within their culture are promoting diversity as a way of growing diverse markets, giving themselves legitimacy. It's sort of commodifying, as they've said, Blackness and objectifying Black people in that regard. I suppose I have been behind the idea that inequities in healthcare, disparities in healthcare, could be overcome with appropriate manpower, training, and diversity. I hope that, I believe, is that a business case? I think it's a public health, it's a health equity case. I guess it's a health equity case rather than necessarily a business case. I think that if companies only focus on building markets, the business, without eventually evolving to the question of true barriers to racial equity, I think that is clearly a recipe for disaster. I have to believe that in the summer that we have seen enough in 9 minutes to change some of that, and that we're seeing much more rich in discussions. Time will tell, and I think time will tell in the not too distant future whether or not we're seeing whether or not there will be more commitment to the deeper problems. Holding a narrow concept of Blackness. This is where the idea is, yes, we'll bring in people that don't look like us and don't come from our background, but are able to behave in a way that we perceive as acceptable, and appear in a way that is acceptable to us. A majority, and in many ways, in cases, male-dominant white culture. And the management, and so the DEI role is to sort of manage that, to keep people sort of in, not so much in line, but there's a monitoring process that happens, and to modify identity and appearance. Yes, I've experienced that, and I have fully engaged in it. My dreadlocks are long gone. They never grew. I never grew them. Okay, and to some degree, I am an example of some of that, I think that the whole concept of becoming woke is recognizing that and coming to find authenticity, and I discover authenticity, and that can come in different ways. We're not monolithic, are we? And we come with different perspectives and experiences so there is no one way to be Black by any stretch of the imagination. But the question is, are you really willing to open up the cultural gates so that you create space for people who come to this place from a variety of different backgrounds, and protect them from that sort of tendency to be overjudged by the larger culture of the working culture, allowing them to flourish for who they are. And I think that's where my job is at this stage in my career, is to open those doors, open those gates, create discussions, create conversations, create opportunity for people to understand the different journeys that that bring us here, and allow people to feel safe. I think that is my tall order, and I want to hear what Rodney has to say about that, and as well. So a blanket perspective of diversity, applying the idea that diversity is good for business. Diversity advances creativity. And these things are all true, but DEI officers are really supposed to address the power dynamics that create discrimination, create marginalization. And to say that diversity in terms of, hey, you went to Yale or Harvard, or you went to state school versus a private school, is not the same as talking about diversity that allows someone who's coming from, a lower socioeconomic experience, perhaps, to allow them into the corporate environment or the medical environment and the academic environment, allow them to flourish and bring that diversity and that experience to enrich that environment is a very different situation. So there is this kind of flattening out of what that definition is. It's broadly applied to characteristics that do not significantly influence identity, access, and equity, which should really be the driving aim. So the call to action by the authors, and so what's my experience? I'm sorry, I'm supposed to be reflecting a little bit on what my experience is with this. I think that we see a great deal of, in my organizations, national organizations, I've been a member of multiple, as you can imagine, diverse and inclusion groups. And one of the things that I was very happy to see happen with the SUO, when Dr. Stringer was the president, he pushed through the idea that we need 2 diversity committees. We need one that's committed to underrepresented in medicine diversity, and one that's committed to gender. Because how many of us have been in diversity committees that have become sort of co-opted one into a little bit more of a gender, which is important. It's an issue. I'm not minimizing, but the mechanisms needed to address those 2 issues don't always overlap, often don't overlap. And so I think that really focusing on them as individual needs that require different kinds of efforts is important. Call to action by the authors, that the D&I practitioners, that they promote a climate that's oriented around fairness, equity, and justice, rather than profit maximization at the expense of Black employees' dignity and well-being. So there's examples where I think companies are starting to get this, and particularly over the last several months, we're seeing movements in that direction. I think the academia is starting to get that. We've had several months of a full, and I believe authentic reflection by Duke School of Medicine that has engaged an entire very diverse group of faculty and students. And I believe that out of that, we're going to have some significant resources. It helps that we have a modestly diverse leadership. We have a chancellor who's African-American in Eugene, Washington, and that certainly it's got to count for something. And we have other, we have a female dean who's very, I think, genuinely wants to make change. A shift from managing Blackness to eradicating racism and its underpinnings, and the denial of racism in the organization. The denial issue is one that has to be addressed up front. To undo practices that undermine Black employee satisfaction, inclusion, and performance. Examine what is considered acceptable professional workplace norms and behaviors. Make sure that those are not culturally biased, to really examine those, that individuals are valid for their ideas, perspectives, and contributions. To facilitate the creation of space for employees to hold difficult conversation. That's the only way we're going to learn, to understand how we got to where we are. Sharing experiences of inclusion as well as non-inclusion or ostracism. It's challenging, but as the last quotation, it's challenging, but organizations need to contend with their racist past head on and really figure out how to move forward. This has been a very interesting time, and it's a painful time. It's a painful time, the evidence of significant hate persists, of state-sponsored violence persists, but I'm an optimistic person, and that's one of the reasons I took the position of leadership. I think you can't do this kind of job without expecting that there is a core of good and an ability to shape that good into something that's good for everybody. So anyway, I'm looking forward to the conversation, getting feedback, and hearing other people's thoughts.
Thank you, Dr. Francis. Dr. Taylor, would you like to step up and just do your discussion?
Sure. I'm gonna share screen here. Let's see here.
I think, Dr. Francis, you may have to stop sharing your screen.
Are you able to see my screen?
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
Well, good evening, everyone. And it really is a privilege to get a chance to meet with my peers and really discuss what I think are important topics. These are topics that we live every day. And as Howard nicely went through the article that he went through. And Romaine, I hope you will forgive me. I took some liberties. I really enjoyed the article. I think the topic, authenticity in the workplace, is something that we've all had to deal with from the time we stepped foot into education. And so it was something that was, very real, something that I've contemplated, for many decades and scores of hours. And some of the topics that the paper, that the article goes through, I think we'll all be able to relate to. And so I pulled out a number of what I thought were some of the important themes, concepts, as I summarized the paper. I won't perhaps dissect it, paragraph by paragraph, but again, just pulling out what I think are some of the important points and concepts that the article talks about, and then hoping to just share my personal experience. Not that I'm at all an expert, I'm still a student on this topic, but certainly my own journey has given me reasons to think about it in my own context. And so I think the foremost concept that is brought up in this article about authenticity in the workplace is this concept called facades of conformity. And Yulin describes this or defines this as false representations, for those who may not have read the entire article, false representations that individuals and organizations create to convey that they embrace the organization's values. And I think that that encompasses it all. And I think that as African Americans, we live a very unique perspective in that, because as I'll speak about later, when you talk about an organization's sort of values, we tend to, in the lives that we are living, we have not had a significant part in defining those values. And so that's where, as this article will describe, African Americans are particularly susceptible to this idea of facades of conformity. And it's a way where you're suppressing personal views while conveying alignment with goals of organization. And that really describes a tension that people may live every day. There may be values that are near and dear to you individually, but specifically to our experience as African Americans, that will be in daily conflict. And there's a cost to that. There's a price to that. And the way we each have decided to navigate that is a learned experience. There isn't necessarily a particular roadmap that we have been able to have access to tell us how to navigate and balance those conflicts. This idea of facades of conformity, I think that from the time we were young, these concepts are linked to pejorative terms that we're all familiar with, and they may not describe it entirely, but this idea that if you conform too much, you're going to be labeled an Uncle Tom. And again, I mean no offense to anyone in particular, but these are just all concepts that we've been introduced literally since we were single-digit age. Or an Oreo, you are one of a few who look like us, which many of us have been in, and one's attempt to try to strike the right balance by his or her peers may seem insufficient, and you'll get titled or labeled with these kinds of pejorative terms that, again, we're all familiar with. And so, this idea of organizational values and norms, that require conforming, I think the real key here is that they are established by the majority by definition, and they often derive from very different cultural and historical experiences from those creating the facades. And so by virtue of how we look, how we express ourselves, how we've come up, we have been, when we enter into an environment, whether it's, in your practice, whether it's in your institution or the institutions that we've trained in, we are given some labels. And I think a lot of the work on unconscious bias and implicit bias has uncovered a lot of the labels and biases that have been directed towards us. And it's a conversation that our majority peers have increasingly had. And many, I think, have been very receptive to understanding how these organizational values have been unfairly or incorrectly attributed to us as African Americans. And so I think a little bit about some of the things that resonate in this article, and I'll get into a little bit more about personal experiences. And some of what I provide as personal experiences here, I started at high school, but again, these go back to, for many of us, kindergarten or so forth. But for me, this was the first time I think I really confronted it in a very meaningful way. I grew up in my early formative years in North Philadelphia. And for those who know Philly, 23rd and Lehigh, my claim to fame is that I grew up next door to Jill Scott, who's my god sister. And my parents were from that environment. So as I began to my journey in education, it started from a context where my entire neighborhood, my entire church, my entire early educational environment was, everyone looked like me. And it was a very comforting experience with rich mentors. And I think it was critical to developing an academic confidence and so forth that I've desperately looked to embrace throughout every aspect of my journey. But then I got a scholarship to a high school that was a majority, very privileged environment, which I'm very grateful for. But it absolutely, from day one, made me confront some of the differences that were unfamiliar to me. And so that was probably my early start in that. And I will tell you that even to this day, this idea, this concept of authenticity is one that I'm regularly brought back to reassess as I try to be my most authentic self. I think about advice that I got in college as my next example. It was a gentleman, young man named Akeem, who I really looked up to, kept himself very sharp. And he told me before I started interviewing for medical school, he said, wear glasses, shave your mustache. He says, you got to break up your blackness. You got to make them comfortable. And so this whole idea, even when our peers are sharing it with us, and this is yet one example, I'm sure each of you has a dozen that you can readily talk about. To me, my father, he lost his stripes in the military because he wanted to grow a mustache. So this idea of getting rid of my mustache to interview was something that definitely I wasn't comfortable with. Now, probably a dozen years later, as I tried for 30 years to grow a mustache that people barely noticed, I got one gray hair in it and it went off. But that was a different set of principles that governed it. But again, even something as critical that we have all done, as you try to prepare and do your best and have medical school interview, I had to grapple with this idea of conformity and authenticity. And even in medical school, I remember I decided I wanted to be going to a surgical field, and my chief resident, he was, when you were supposed to dole out assignments to what OR you're going to, the guy kept skirting me. And I would wander to the OR and come into a room. And one day on rounds, he said to me, I'm still post-call, waking up, he said, Harvard Medical School must be very happy. We've got a Black and an Asian on the team. Now, I'm trying to think, what did that have to do with anything? But again, it puts us on the defensive to decide how we're going to address even those microaggressions and so forth. And that too is a conversation about how authentic you're going to be and how you're going to deal with the task of being authentic when you're confronted with things like that. This idea, has impact and consequences. The article talks about. It literally comes down to often when we're dealing with this, you're thinking about success or survival, and it literally becomes dichotomous in that way. And sometimes what you decide to do or not to do, what you say or don't, is governed by how desperately you would like to be successful and or survive in an environment. Obviously, if you're dealing with that on a regular basis, it has psychological wellness and job satisfaction implications. And the idea, and Scott Page writes about this idea of a diverse organization and how diverse organizations have higher organizational output and productivity. And what is lost when you don't create an environment, a just environment where people can feel authentic, you will have symbolic, covert conflict and veiled sabotage, as Morrow was referenced in this article. You're gonna get less productivity, you're gonna get less job satisfaction, and you're gonna have individuals who are struggling with psychological wellness. Even if you struggle well and admirably, it's still a struggle. And so this article looks at a couple of different studies in the general workforce and even among professions. And in essence, what is revealed in the studies is that African Americans engage in creating facades more than any other ethnic group. And this act of creating these facades is the antithesis of authentic self-expression, which is really when we are free and when we are celebrating and affirming our culture and our experience. That's what makes us happy. And too often we're not permitted to do that without the fear of potential retribution or consequences. And so all of this, the article points out, is rooted in historical, deeply ingrained negative stereotypes about Blackness and the punishment of nonconformity. And some of these stereotypes may be a little bit more specific to Black men, some Black women, and this article describes them, but they have been described for us and often given to us when you walk in. And it is your job, whether you like it or not, to navigate how you're going to address that label that has been put on you. And that's work that we don't get in college or medical school. But there are forums like this where we get a chance to discuss it that are critical. And so, at least in the studies that were described here, African American law associates, which make up 1.8%, which strikingly is very similar to the African American population of otolaryngologists in this country, very similar. But one of the things it describes is that particularly among law associates, your book of business, your success, your earnings is very much relationship driven, and your ability to connect to the power brokers within that organization. And so for lawyers in particular, it appears that that is critical, how you get handed cases, good jobs, and so forth. But I'd like to think that in our specialty, we enjoy a specialty that is considered privileged because we have garnered certain successes in our medical school, that we have been fortunate enough to be able to train in our specialty and to practice in this. I submit that much of our ability to secure the positions that we have secured also rest on our ability to make connections and have relationships, whether it's we're going to be AOA or the Gold Humanism and Humanity Society, Honor and Humanity Society, or just even asking for a letter of recommendation. How do you get a strong endorsement from someone who is, a majority person? There's 2% of you in this field, and get a recommendation that's going to distinguish yourself. And we have had to do that, and we've been able to do that successfully. And so my last slide, really, as I wrap up is, and I hope I haven't gone too far, it's just in terms of how I've defined it is that I've had some mentors, my father first, who I would call uber authentic. I think that the lesson I learned from him, I first admired and respected his ability to speak his mind at any cost. But even as a 13-year-old, I watched some of how he, what the cost was of that. And I challenged myself to try to think, how can you be truly authentic and not always expend that kind of goodwill or cost every time? And that's something I've thought about a lot. And I think that there are examples that we all know. Martin Luther King Jr., he didn't have any teeth mark on his tongue. He never bit his tongue, and he spoke his mind, but he did so with a precision and a refinement and with a care of choice of words that I think made him extremely effective. And I don't know if any of you know Alan Counter. He was a real life version of that for me. He was the director of the Harvard Foundation for Diversity and Cultural Affairs, who was a tremendous role model and mentor to me. He was a PhD, living in a world that I wanted to one day enjoy success. And I called upon him a couple times. One, in medical school when I was one of two Black men, and one Black, my co-classmate got into a fight and he was expelled immediately. And I called upon Dr. Counter to help navigate a conversation with the powers that be to allow this young man have his story told and to be able to successfully, graduate. And then another time when I was in residency, it was when a lot of the affirmative action discussion was happening at the University of Michigan. And he came in and he gave audience to the entire medical community there. And he first met them by discussing some of his research, which everyone could relate to. And then he broke down in very factual terms, and he was surgical with his vocabulary. And he really was able to enlighten the entire audience on how their context of affirmative action and where they started thinking about it was so incorrect, and gave multiple examples why. But he's someone who passed away a few years ago, who was a tremendous role model and example. And I think I'm going to stop there, Romaine, because I think I probably exhausted my time and want to leave some time for questions too, but I'll stop there.
All right, thank you so much. Okay, Dr. Thompson, you're up next. And then we'll have a brief discussion afterwards.
Romaine, thank you.
Thank you.
Is everyone able to see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Romaine, friends, colleagues, it's really, I feel at home here. There's lots of people in this group that I have literally grown up with. And I was also surprised to see some of my former colleagues from Mayo on this too. So I really feel at home tonight, so thank you. Romaine asked me to review an article entitled African American Women as Change Agents in the White Academy. And, I would say that there was much about this article that really resonates with me. And I think it's actually relevant for all the men on this, this Zoom also, because it's really about that journey of African Americans in the White Academy. This article just happened to be focused on women as the change agents. It's written by two authors. I thought one of the things I really learned from this is something around what's called the grounded theory methodology. This is a methodology I had never heard of. I think to summarize it, it is a way of taking qualitative information about people's experiences and setting standard questions and coming up with themes to kind of justify that this was the experience. So these two women interviewed 18 women who were navigators in a variety of different academic fields, some in historically Black universities, some in the White Academy, but all of them had had a common experience walking in this direction. So he asked us to kind of review our own little personal experience through this. So I've had the fortune for now a little over 3 years of having a national platform to talk and speak in this area. And it's taken some support and some courage. Just a little bit about my background is I'm a third generation African-American physician. This also makes me a third generation member of the National Medical Association. I have been going to the NMA meeting since I was 3 years old. My grandfather was the only Black physician for about 100-mile radius in Northeast Mississippi. He got paid with chickens and eggs and all kinds of things that you could never imagine in this day and age. My dad was in private practice obstetrics and gynecology, focused in an inner city patient population and really valued addressing social determinants of health. And in his own little practice, he reduced the preterm labor rate by 75% in his community as a small practitioner. This was in the 1970s and 80s. I have walked in this white academy since I was born, basically. My parents really, I think, shielded me from their experiences of the 60s and racism, and really kind of gave me an environment to learn and grow. And I would say that that experience was not always easy. Here are the organizations I've worked in. You can see that some probably are a little bit more diverse than others. A shout out to Carter Van Weiss. I do want to let you know I was one of the early recipients of one of the medical student NIDCD opportunities in 1991. So I really appreciated you bringing that up, because I think that those are the kinds of opportunities that were important in shaping my own personal pathway. I entered otolaryngology head and neck surgery at the age of 22, coming out of a 6-year BAMD program. I loved the specialty. I had no one who looked like me as a mentor. And this was the beginning of what I would say was a very unrealized journey as a pioneer. I was determined to train at a top-ranked program. I ended up, once I showed up, I found out I was the first Black woman intern ever in otolaryngology, or in general surgery, or in otolaryngology. And this was 1991, mind you not, in my training program. In 1999, I was the first Black woman staff at the Mayo Clinic in surgery. I was the first Black woman to obtain rank of professor at that organization and nationally in terms of otolaryngology head and neck surgery. And then when I moved to Chicago, I've been the first endowed chair as a woman in pediatric otolaryngology. And I was also the first Black president of a major academic society. I think what this really says is everything my grandfather, my mother, and my father aspired for me has been possible. That journey has been grit, determination, help, support, and inspiration from many people. And I would say that the diagram from this article that really resonates, and I think anybody could take this diagram that is on the Zoom and walk through this, is starting in the center in this wide academy of that robust sense of self. We have had to put ourselves out there. You know, for me and my childhood, it was going to the skating rink and being the only Black kid in the skating rink and competing. Then I made a decision to go to a 6-year BAMD med school with very few Blacks. Then I made a decision I wanted to pursue otolaryngology head and neck surgery. So it's that pathway of constantly exposing yourself and self-risking and having that kind of external and internal battle that goes on in your head about that. I think that journey also takes some persistence and persisting as one of these bubbles in this whole dimension. And I would say early on in my career, it was really much self-risking, persisting, leading to this back and forth of something called disease. I think others reflected into like kind of that mental gymnastics that goes on in your head as you're showing up in these kinds of environments. Then you step out of the box and you see and name the whiteness of the academy. And you have to be very thoughtful about when you're going to say something. And sometimes you're not as thoughtful about when you're going to say something. But there can be the silent price to pay. There can be the retribution of it. There could be the loss of a job opportunity because of it. There could be a pay cut because of it. There can also be advocacy because of that. And I think that that's all the journey that we all kind of experience in our head when we are in that form of really naming the whiteness or describing the experience. I like to say it's educating others. And so that creates this constant circle. I would say it wasn't later until my career, and probably not into my mid-40s, that I really started to find my voice and exercising voice and agency. By this time in my mid-40s, I had started a service line at an organization that had not had that previously. I was recognized for my research by the Triologic Society. I took on several leadership roles, and I still didn't really feel like I had my voice. And it wasn't really until I started working in a bit more of a diverse environment and the year I was president of the ABA, I used that platform as my presidential platform to talk about disruption, innovation, diversity, and inclusion. There was really kind of this journey in my own head about these experiences. And I think because I was somehow either found the courage or wanted to share, or a combination of both, I became acknowledged for doing so. And so that, I think, has given me that voice and agency to be a lot more open about talking about my experience and being supported by many people in doing so. So I would say this robust sense of self diagram really resonated with me. And I would encourage everybody to look at that article and kind of work through that pathway and how that feels and what that means to you. Some of the high level things that I think I took away from this, firstly, is the emotional tax. It's that disease, that impact of this journey in your mind and your body and your spirit. Those constant challenges to your authority, skill, and knowledge. You may be very, very knowledgeable, but someone is going to question that. This uneven burden that both Rodney and Howard spoke to earlier of, you're taking on the weight of the world because you are the only one, or you're one of a few, or you feel this need to express what you're feeling or you're seeing, or the inequity or the injustice. I think also, I often felt I was under the microscope and that I was getting watched closer than others. I mean, it could be perceived or real, but that feeling of need to be perfect and kind of the emotional tax of that, and then also the environment. You know, one of the ways to describe this emotional tax is kind of this state of being on guard all the time. You and I walk into work, we're prepared for our cases, we're prepared to take care of patients, but it's also kind of gearing our heads around being prepared to deal with bias or discrimination or negative assumptions about us and our skill. And also kind of that weight of the responsibility of representing our race sometimes. So that was one of these words were heavily embedded in this article, and I thought really resonated. The other were some of the intricate dynamics between the experience, and these were some of the other words that were described: discouragement, rage, stress, and frustration. How many of us have had those in our day? And how many of us have had those in the same day where we're feeling energetic and zest and determination? And it kind of creates this somewhat gray fog into your head. You know, and that's why I like this imagery around this. And I think for me, what I have learned is really important is having a good core sense of what your values are. You know, and my values are, I demand excellence. Everything I do, I want to have some type of impact and positive impact, include people. And speaking earlier, it's not just diversity of race or ethnicity or gender, but it's also diversity of thought. And I think everybody wants to be included. And I think that is something that we can teach each other and teach people who may not see that as part of the definition of inclusion, as part of that oneness and that commonality we may all have just as being human and people. I've also valued innovation. How do we do things different? I am different. I show up into a room, I'm different. And curiosity and really questioning things and encouraging other people to question things and developing some resilience. You know, I think it's also important for us to continue to recognize this pipeline is leaky in otolaryngology head and neck surgery. This is the US Census, we're 13% Black, but then when we go down to medical students, it's 7%. Applicants to otolaryngology is 6%. The actual number who rank and match are 2.3%. And then when you go to assistant professor, associate professor, and full professor, and somehow I asked myself, what was that pathway that I didn't fall out here and somehow I ended up here? And there were a couple of things in this article that, you know, I really thought were important to highlight in navigating what is called the white academy. I think firstly for me, I call this my wall of 8 white men. And I think if I had sat around in my residency program waiting to be mentored by people who looked like me, it was never going to happen. And so I think mentorship and sponsorship is important. And it's also important for us to recognize, and I'm really encouraging the students and the trainees to have the courage to start building these relationships with people who may not look like you. And for me, I had to acknowledge my own bias about who could actually mentor me. I mean, my mentoring started right here with Mike Heaney and Carrie Olson. When I didn't get an interview after doing a rotation at the Mayo Clinic for residency, these two men advocated for me to the program chair and the department chair. And I can honestly say every single one of these people on this slide had some type of impact in my career, but what it required was creating allyship. And I think what it required on my part was being a little bit vulnerable and describing an experience to Dr. DeSanto when a patient said something that they shouldn't have said, describing an experience to another mentor or another person that I reported to or was responsible for my education. And as I look back and reflect, I see that it really helped them grow in their own leadership, and it gives them an opportunity to learn from you as they move forward with leading, mentoring, sponsoring, and coaching. And, you know, I have to say the two people that I thought really demonstrated that most for me were probably Carrie Olson, Robin Cotton, and Miles Penzak. So I think the three major takeaways from this article for me: pivoting on the margin, meaning you're on the margin, how are you going to pivot? First was exercising voice and agency and having a lot of self-awareness of what you represent. Your presence represents change, and over time, really learning how to honor it and how to own it. And think about the impact that we all have. It has a reverberating impact in education and the trainees that we educate and how we bring others into the fold. It has an impact on studying and asking questions and research related to health equity and access and diversity and things that other people may not think about, which ultimately all of this has an impact to 21st century healthcare delivery. I think what else is important is creating and claiming free spaces. You know, for me as a woman of color, it took a while for me to really realize what this meant. What is it that is unique about you that makes a positive impact on the greater whole? And create that space and claim it, because it's often going to be a free space in your environment. I think the third takeaway for me is persisting and agentic qualities. And I have to say, if I had the agentic qualities that I have now 20 years ago, life would have been a lot easier. That is being proactive, doing a lot of self-reflection and being self-regulated in your reactions to things, looking at the environmental cues, doing really a strategic assessment of ways to bring about change to the institutional environment or the environment that you work in, that you inspire others, and really choosing which battles to fight. And right now, I've really chose to focus on the ones that benefit the whole. I think strategies for all of us that experience this emotional tax, firstly, focus on self-regulation and preserve your energy. Not every action, not every word requires a reaction, and really learn to create effective ways of speaking up with the intention to educate and lead mindset change. I think you also have to manage the narrative. Stereotypes and biases are there, unfortunate. They happen, but don't let them stop you from achieving your full potential. Find healthy outlets, put yourself in the right environment. It may be you work in an organization that is committed to leadership change and has a commitment to this. And you may work in a place that may be a little bit further behind, but ask yourself, does your presence positively impact change? And how can you ally yourself with people to really do that? That's going to really create and require a community of peers and a social network. I like this diagram of the ladder of oppression because I think we've all experienced this either at an interpersonal level or an interpersonal level, at the institutional level, the community, or the systemic level. Some of us have experienced various stages of this and at different times in our life cycles, and frankly, at different exposures, you know. And so I think this all creates who we are. And, I'm really encouraging people to own the experience and knowledge gained from this ladder of oppression to make a positive impact. And, I think for me, really, it's required a mosaic of people. And this is one of my favorite slides that I include in some of my my conversations and representation of this. And you will see over almost a 30-year career since medical school that my mosaic of people looks very different. No one looks like me, except for maybe a few. But that's what I think that it really is going to take. So I'll do a moment of pause and really welcome conversation and dialogue with the whole team here, and Howard and Rodney. Really thank you for being part of the conversation with us tonight also.
Thank you. That was outstanding. Well, we got a few minutes left. We're over as usual, but this was a really great conversation.